Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into something a little closer to our own time, but no less bleak. Forget the clean uniforms and heroic speeches you might have seen in movies. This is about the day-to-day reality of American soldiers in Vietnam, and specifically the bottles, cans and hidden flasks that got them through it, or destroyed them trying. This isn't a story of glory, or medals, or even strategy. It's about sweat, boredom, fear, and the constant burn of cheap alcohol sloshing inside a steel canteen where water should have been. Before we get started, take a second to get comfortable. Dim the lights, maybe put on a fan for some white noise. If you want, grab a drink, but maybe not the strong stuff for this one. And if you enjoy sinking into these darker corners of history, hit like or subscribe, but only if you actually want more of this. I always love seeing where you're tuning in from, so drop it in the comments if you feel like it. Now, close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself waking up in a sweltering tent halfway around the world. The air is heavy, damp, and smells like mildew mixed with cigarettes. Somewhere outside, helicopters thump overhead. Insects screech from the trees, and the jungle feels like it's pressing against the walls. You're young, maybe 90 and maybe 21, and you've been shipped here with nothing but a uniform, a rifle, and the half-baked promise that you're helping stop communism. You're already sweating before you've even sat up on your cot. You reach for your canteen, but it isn't filled with water. It's filled with cheap whiskey or a flat beer, because that's what gets you through another day. Welcome to Vietnam, where alcohol is everywhere, control is nowhere, and survival doesn't always mean coming home in one piece. You open your eyes, but it doesn't feel like morning. It feels like the air itself is sitting on your chest. The tent canvas above you is stained with mildew spots, drooping from last night's rain. Everything is wet. Your clothes are wet. Your skin is wet. Even the blanket that was supposed to keep you dry is soaked through with the dampness that never leaves this place. Welcome to the jungle, where nothing ever really dries, and the humidity makes sure you start sweating before you even stand up. The soundscape is already alive, and not in the peaceful way. Helicopter blades thud somewhere in the distance, a mechanical heartbeat that never really stops. Bugs the size of your thumb scream from the trees, and a chorus of frogs croak from the swampy edges of the camp. You hear boots scuffling outside, a couple of guys arguing over cigarettes, and someone vomiting into a coffee can behind the tent. The smell hits you a second later, mixing with the stale stench of beer cans that were tossed in a pile the night before. You roll over and glance at the guy on the cot next to you. He's out cold, sprawled in his uniform pants and boots, shirt unbuttoned, dog tags sticking to his chest from the sweat. The empty bottle beside him explains why. Some soldiers drink themselves to sleep, others drink themselves unconscious. And by the look of him, he went for option 2. His hand still rests half-curled around the neck of a bottle of bourbon that had been rationed out 3 nights ago. Technically, that bottle was supposed to last a week. In reality, it barely lasted until midnight. You sit up, rubbing your eyes. They feel gritty, not from sleep, but from the constant haze of cigarette smoke that lingers in every corner of the camp. Somebody's already lit one, the acrid smell mixing with damp earth and sweat. You reach for your canteen without thinking, like you've been trained to do since boot camp. Hydrate. Keep the body going. But this isn't filled with water. You twist the cap and take a swallow of warm beer, because at some point water stopped feeling safe. Maybe it was when you saw what the guys upstream were doing in the river. Maybe it was when you realised the barrels were full of bugs and algae before they ever got boiled. Or maybe you just needed something stronger to keep the fear away. Either way, the beer became your water, and no one really questioned it anymore. The taste is awful, warm, metallic, flat from sitting in the heat all night. But it's alcohol, and that's what matters. It cuts through the fog in your head, even if it leaves a burn in your stomach. You look around the tent and see half a dozen other soldiers doing the same thing. Someone's taking swigs straight from a bottle of gin he traded for with a supply clerk. Another guy pours a little whiskey into his instant coffee, stirring it with a dirty spoon. Morning rituals don't involve brushing teeth or stretching. Morning rituals here are about finding something that numbs the body just enough to face another endless day. The ground under your boots is mud. It's always mud. You try to lace them tighter, but they're still damp from yesterday's patrol, the leather swollen and stiff. Your socks are wet too, but changing them doesn't help much when the next pair is just as soggy. Someone once said trench foot was a thing of the First World War. They never lived in this jungle, where your feet never dry, and your only comfort is the occasional swallow of something strong enough to distract you from the rot. Outside, a group of soldiers are already gathered around a folding table. It's not breakfast, as you'd picture it, with eggs, bacon or toast. It's cans of beer and bottles passed around in silence. A couple of them mumble jokes, but the laughter sounds hollow, the kind of laugh that doesn't reach anyone's eyes. One guy crushes a can on his forehead, another flicks the tab into the mud. The pile of discarded cans has grown into a small metal mountain by now, glinting in the morning sun. Someone will bury it later, or maybe they won't. The jungle swallows everything eventually. You hear one of the sergeants barking at a soldier who can barely stand up straight. He reeks of rum, his shirt stained with vomit. The sergeant doesn't punish him. He just tells him to get his head together because there's a patrol scheduled in an hour. That's the unspoken rule here. As long as you can still carry your rifle and walk in a straight enough line, no one cares what you poured down your throat the night before. Discipline fades in the heat, just like everything else. Your stomach growls, but the thought of eating the powdered eggs and canned meat waiting in the mess makes you feel worse. Most guys skip it and just drink. A few brave souls chew on hard crackers while sipping beer like it's orange juice. Food is fuel, but booze is survival. It calms the shaking hands. It helps you forget the sound of gunfire from last night. It numbs the images that keep replaying in your head, the ones you'd rather drown than relive sober. You take another long sip, and for a second, it almost feels normal. Back home, you were too young to drink legally, but here it's practically encouraged. The PX is stocked with cases of beer, and the local vendors sell bottles of rice wine so cheap it feels like theft. Soldiers pool their money and buy them in bulk, hauling back crates like they're carrying ammunition. Alcohol isn't just allowed, it's part of the system. It's how men get through each day, how they keep the illusion of control when everything around them screams chaos. The sun starts to climb, and with it the heat grows unbearable. Sweat rolls down your face, your shirt clings to your back, and the beer in your stomach makes you queasy. You hear a chopper pass low overhead, rattling the tin roofs and scattering dust into the air. You know it won't be long before orders come down, before you're out there again with your rifle, stumbling through the mud, half drunk, half awake, praying you don't trip over a booby trap. But for now, you sit, sip, and wait, because that's what mornings in Vietnam look like. Not coffee, not eggs, just another can cracked open, another warm swallow of courage, another soldier numbing himself enough to make it through the day. And as you sit there, you realise this is only the start. The drinking never really stops. It stretches from dawn until whatever time you collapse again. A cycle that keeps repeating because the alternative, staying sober, feeling everything, might be more unbearable than the war itself. Your boots hit the tarmac in Saigon, and before you even adjust to the blast of heat and the smell of diesel fumes, you're struck by something else entirely. Noise. Not the steady jungle chorus you'll come to know later, but the chaos of a city at war. Horns blare, trucks rattle past, and voices shout in a mix of English, Vietnamese, and the slurred universal language of men already several drinks deep before noon. The war hasn't really touched you yet, not in the personal sense, but the drinking culture makes itself known the second you step off the plane. The first thing most soldiers notice isn't the humidity or the strange sights of motorbikes weaving through traffic, or even the armed guards posted at every corner. It's the smell of beer. The airport itself has kiosks and vendors who know exactly what fresh arrivals want, and it isn't a map or directions. It's a bottle. You're barely 18 or 19, wearing fatigues that still feel stiff, trying to keep your nerves in check, and then someone shoves a cold can into your hand. Not water, not soda, beer. A lukewarm American brand that somehow made its way across the Pacific in bulk shipments meant for the troops. You pop the tab, and the hiss feels like a welcome you didn't expect. The taste is flat, metallic, and skunky from the long voyage, but you don't care. It's something familiar in a place that feels anything but. Around you, other young men are doing the same thing, laughing a little too loud, pushing each other, pretending that everything's fine. They've just landed in a war zone, but with a beer in hand, it feels less like an invasion, and more like the world's worst vacation package. Outside the airport gates, the reality deepens. The streets are lined with bars, taverns, and makeshift stalls, all competing for the flood of American money. Neon signs buzz overhead, promising cold drinks, good times, and other services you're not supposed to talk about in letters home. The air is thick with cigarette smoke, frying food, and the sweet bite of cheap liquor. Saigon isn't just a city. It's an open invitation to drink yourself numb before you even learn where your assigned base is located. The army doesn't exactly discourage it. They know morale is fragile, that fear sets in quickly, and that young men far from home need something to cling to. Officially, alcohol is regulated, rationed, meant to be controlled. Unofficially, everyone looks the other way. You can walk into the PX with a couple of dollars and walk out with a case of beer heavy enough to pull your arms from their sockets. The rules say it's limited. The clerks say, "Sure, buddy, take another." They know you're going to need it. That first sip in Saigon hits differently than the warm beer back in camp. Here, the city hums with temptation. Soldiers wander the streets with bottles in hand, clinking glasses in bars that never seem to close, drowning their jitters before they have even fired a shot in combat. It feels like a reward, like a strange little buffer between the familiar world you just left and the unforgiving jungle waiting for you up north. You find yourself in a dim bar not long after arriving. The lights are low, The fans overhead barely push the hot air, and the tables are crowded with uniforms just like yours. Some guys are on their first drink, others are already slurring, and it's not even mid-afternoon. The beer comes in endless supply, and the whiskey is poured heavy into chipped glasses. A jukebox croaks out American songs, though the static drowns most of the lyrics. For a second, if you squint and ignore the uniforms, it could almost pass for a bar back home. Almost. Except back home, you wouldn't see rifles leaned against the wall, or men toasting each other before being shipped to places where half of them won't come back. One of the older guys at your table claps you on the back. He tells you to drink up, to enjoy it while you can, because soon enough you'll be wishing you had another. His words aren't encouraging, they're a warning. He gulps down a shot and chases it with a swallow of beer, then grins like it's the only thing keeping him sane. You do the same, feeling the burn in your throat and the warmth in your stomach. It doesn't take much to realise why alcohol flows so freely here. The city outside the bar is just as soaked in liquor as the inside. Vendors sell rice wine in reused bottles, the liquid cloudy and strong enough to strip paint. It costs next to nothing, and soldiers line up for it anyway, handing over crumpled bills, laughing at the fire that races down their throats when they take a sip. Some of them cough, some of them spit it out, but they still keep buying more. Anything to feel a little less like they're standing on the edge of something they don't understand. As the day drags on, you see it everywhere. Groups of soldiers stumbling out of bars, tripping on curbs, shouting into the street. Others passed out in alleys, helmets still strapped on, rifles lying beside them. Officers turn a blind eye, as long as the men show up for transport when their names are called. The chaos becomes part of the routine. Drink, laugh, fight, blackout, repeat. Saigon is the funnel through which every soldier passes, and alcohol is the lubricant that makes the transition from civilian life to combat even remotely bearable. When night falls, the city doesn't quiet down. If anything, it gets louder. Music, shouting, clinking bottles, engines revving as taxis weave through the crowd. You sit on the curb with a can in your hand, watching it all swirl around you, and you realise this isn't just a single drink to calm the nerves. This is the start of something bigger, a pattern that's going to follow you from Saigon all the way into the heart of the war. That first sip isn't just about thirst, it's about survival, and it won't be the last. The first thing you notice about the beer in Vietnam isn't the taste, it's the price. Dirt cheap, practically free by American standards. A few coins and you can get a cold can of whatever brand made it through shipping. Cases stacked in the PX, bottles lined up in bars, vendors selling it from wooden carts on street corners. It's everywhere. The joke among soldiers is that beer is safer than water, and in many ways it's true. At least the beer won't give you dysentery within 24 hours. That price tag changes how you drink. Back home, you might pace yourself, sip on a six-pack over a weekend, maybe sneak into a bar with a fake ID if you're still underage. Here, you're buying cases at a time, drinking until the floor tilts under your boots, and no one bats an eye. When a can costs less than a stick of gum, moderation doesn't exist. Men line their cots with empty cans like trophies, stacking them high as if the tower proves they've conquered something. In reality, all it proves is that cheap beer fuels expensive mistakes. At first, the consequences seem small. A missed formation because someone couldn't drag himself out of bed. A patrol delayed because half the squad is nursing hangovers. A rifle misplaced in the corner of a bar, forgotten in the haze of shots and laughter. Officers grumble, but they've been drinking too. The punishment is usually just a shouted warning or extra duty, nothing that actually stops the cycle. And so it keeps going. The problem with cheap beer is that it doesn't stay confined to the base or the bars. It follows you everywhere. Soldiers sneak cans into their packs before heading into the field, cracking them open in the middle of patrols when the heat and boredom become unbearable. The hiss of a tab being pulled in the jungle isn't just common, it's expected. The sound blends with the buzzing insects, the squelch of mud under boots, and the distant thud of artillery. Warm beer, flat and foamy from being jostled in a rucksack, becomes the taste of Vietnam. But cheap doesn't mean harmless. The accidents pile up quickly. A soldier trips on a trail because he's unsteady from the drinks, lands on a punji steak, and spends the next month fighting off infection. Another misfires his rifle cleaning it while drunk, nearly killing the guy in the cot next to him. Fistfights break out nightly, fueled not by real anger, but by the endless supply of beer that loosens tongues and fists alike. Black eyes and broken noses become as common as mosquito bites. It goes deeper than that. Combat and alcohol don't mix, but here they're welded together. You're on edge all the time, adrenaline pumping, hands shaking from fear you can't admit out loud. Beer quiets the nerves just enough to make it through another ambush, another march, another sleepless night. But it also slows your reflexes, dulls your judgment, makes you sloppy when you can't afford to be. Cheap beer turns mistakes into casualties. One night, a convoy rolls out half-loaded on booze. The drivers laugh, shout out the windows, cans rattling under the seats. A few miles down the road, one swerves too wide and flips the truck. Supplies scatter into the mud, rifles and helmets tossed like toys, and a soldier pinned under the wreckage doesn't walk again. Everyone knows why it happened. No one writes drunk in the official report. It just gets filed under accident. The Vietnamese vendors see it all and keep selling. Why wouldn't they? Beer is profit, and the soldiers are endless customers. Rice wine, stronger and cheaper, slips into circulation too, poured into reused bottles with no labels, no guarantees. Some men drink it without hesitation. Others refuse after hearing the stories. Guys going blind, guys collapsing in the street, guys waking up 3 days later with no memory of what happened. But when beer is a nickel and rice wine is even less, caution doesn't always win. The cheapness also makes drinking constant. It isn't just evenings or weekends. It's breakfast, lunch and dinner. A can cracked open at dawn feels no different than one at midnight. Schedules blur when every day looks the same. Hot, wet, dangerous. Beer fills the empty spaces between patrols, between letters from home, between the silence that creeps in when you're too tired to talk. It becomes the clock you live by, measuring time not in hours, but in empties stacked at your feet. The irony is that for something so cheap, the toll it takes is massive. Fights that lead to court-martials. Patrols that go sideways because someone isn't sharp enough to notice the tripwire. Accidents that never should have happened if everyone had been sober. And when the war finally ends for you, when you step back onto American soil, the habit doesn't stay behind. Cheap beer in Vietnam leads to expensive consequences back home. Broken marriages, lost jobs, livers scarred before you hit 30. You don't think about any of that with the first sip, though. You just know it's easy to get, easier to drink, and impossible to stop once the cycle begins. The army never wrote it down in the official ledgers, but everyone knew there was a bar tab running in Vietnam. Not the kind you close out with a tip and a handshake, but one that racked up every day, every night, across thousands of bases and outposts. The debt wasn't measured in dollars, it was measured in discipline, in accidents, in broken men who kept drinking because the army quietly made sure the bottles never ran dry. On paper, the rationing looked controlled. Each soldier was supposed to get a limited number of beers or a set amount of liquor per month. Just enough to keep morale up, just enough to take the edge off. The numbers looked neat and tidy in Washington. A case here, a few bottles there. The reality was a mess. Supply clerks padded the shipments. PX stores sold extra under the table, and officers signed off on special distributions whenever things got particularly grim. A patrol wiped out in the jungle. Hand out whiskey like it's medicine. A base hit with mortars during the night. Cases of beer arrived the next morning, as if hops and barley could patch shrapnel wounds in the brain. The soldiers figured it out quickly. You didn't need to save your ration slips because there was always more. Someone always had an extra crate, an extra bottle tucked under their cot. The army's logistics machine made sure bullets, bandages and booze all travelled together. It was a hidden subsidy, one that never appeared in the briefings but was obvious in every base you stepped onto. The numbers were staggering. In some months, American troops in Vietnam consumed millions of cans of beer. So much that shipping companies struggled to keep up. Planes flew in, not just with ammunition and medical supplies, but with pallets stacked high with beer cases wrapped in plastic, shimmering in the sun as forklifts hauled them across the runway. Soldiers cheered when they saw those shipments arrive. Not because it meant survival, but because it meant another night of forgetting. The army never admitted it, but they relied on alcohol as much as the men did. Drunk soldiers were calmer soldiers, less likely to riot, less likely to refuse orders. Sure, they were also sloppier in the field, but the alternative, sober young men staring down the full horror of the war, seemed worse. Booze became a management tool, a pressure valve that commanders learned to twist open whenever morale sank too low. It was cheaper than real psychiatric care, faster than therapy, and easier than acknowledging that the war itself was driving men to the edge. The hidden bar tab showed itself in the way discipline eroded. Uniform inspections became a joke when half the men showed up bleary-eyed, smelling like whiskey. Training sessions devolved into hangover clinics, instructors yelling at squads that could barely stand straight. Orders were forgotten, mistakes made, weapons misplaced. But as long as the reports back home were clean, no one cared. The army was running a bar as much as it was running a war, and the bill kept getting bigger. It wasn't just the enlisted men, either. Officers drank just as heavily, if not more. Captains and colonels with their own private stashes, bottles tucked into desk drawers, glasses clinking during late-night strategy meetings that sounded more like drunken debates. Decisions about patrol routes, airstrikes, and deployments were sometimes made under the haze of whiskey fumes. A bad call wasn't always the enemy's fault. Sometimes it was the booze, but the paperwork never said so. The hidden tab also extended beyond official supplies. Soldiers pooled their pay to buy from local vendors, creating an underground market that dwarfed the army's own efforts. Cases of beer changed hands in back alleys. Rice wine passed through the wire, and nobody asked questions as long as the flow kept steady. Commanders pretended to crack down, but everyone knew the truth. They were drinking too. The real cost showed up in the sick bays and the body counts. Liver problems in men barely old enough to shave. Accidents that weren't accidents at all. Just drunken missteps written off as bad luck. Patrols ambushed because someone wasn't alert enough to notice the signs. And still the shipments kept coming. The Army's hidden bar tab grew every day, a debt nobody would acknowledge but everybody paid for. You didn't see it on the front page of newspapers. You didn't hear it in speeches. But if you walked into any base in Vietnam, you could see it stacked to the ceiling in aluminum and glass, waiting to be emptied into young men who couldn't stop even if they wanted to. The Army was running up a tab, and the payment would come due long after the war ended. Every soldier in Vietnam learned pretty quickly that the post exchange wasn't just a store. It was a lifeline, a morale machine, and for a lot of men, it was the closest thing to a liquor cabinet the Army was ever going to admit to. PX stores were scattered across bases like little oases, stocked with shaving cream, cigarettes, magazines, and most importantly, alcohol. Rows of beer cans stacked higher than helmets, bottles of whiskey and rum lined up behind the counter, all sold at prices so low they made soldiers laugh out loud. A man could walk in with a few crumpled bills and walk out with enough to get his entire squad drunk for the night. The official story was that it kept men content. Give them the comfort of a cold beer, a familiar brand from back home, and maybe they'd feel less like they were trapped in hell. And in a way, it worked. Soldiers crowded the PX like kids in a candy shop, snatching up cases of Budweiser or Schlitz, laughing about which brand tasted less like swamp water after a day in the sun. The shelves were always busy, and the clerks barely kept up, their hands sticky from handling so many cans and bottles. But it didn't take long for the system to start bending. Rations were supposed to be controlled, a set amount per man, carefully logged. In reality, it turned into a free-for-all. PX clerks traded extra cases under the table for cigarettes, boots, or favours. Officers signed off on special allocations whenever they felt like it, and if you knew the right guy, you never had to worry about running out. Soldiers hauled beer back to their tents by the case, stacking them under cots, hiding bottles in footlockers, creating little private bars inside sweltering canvas walls. The funny thing was that water wasn't always reliable, but beer was. Supply convoys sometimes missed their mark, and bases went days without fresh drinking water. But the PX? Somehow it never ran dry of beer. Planes dropped pallets onto runways. Trucks rumbled through the mud, with crates clattering in the back. Forklifts buzzing across bases, delivering cases like they were medical supplies. Soldiers joked that you could die of thirst in Vietnam, but you'd never run out of alcohol. The routine became so normal that men started planning their days around it. Patrol in the morning, PX run in the afternoon, blackout by nightfall. The beer was warm most of the time, because refrigeration in the jungle was a fantasy. But no one cared. A lukewarm can of Bud was still better than staring at the ceiling, listening to artillery thud in the distance, with nothing in your system to dull the edge. Liquor was a little harder to get, but not impossible. The PX kept bottles tucked away, sold in limited amounts, but limited was more of a suggestion. Soldiers hoarded whiskey like gold, pouring it into canteens, mixing it into coffee, or just drinking it straight from the neck. Some units made rituals out of it. Shots passed around before heading out on patrol. A kind of liquid armour against what waited in the jungle. Nobody said it was smart. It was just the way things were. And then there was the barter economy. A soldier could trade almost anything for a bottle if he knew who to ask. Extra cigarettes, a spare knife, even a clean pair of socks could get you a can of beer when supplies were low. It wasn't just currency. It was survival. Men who didn't drink still traded for booze because they knew someone else would want it, and favours could be bought with liquor faster than with cash. The PX became more than just a store. It was the army's unspoken admission that men couldn't fight this war sober. Every can sold was another reminder that alcohol was built into the system, not an accident, not a loophole, but a deliberate part of the daily grind. And the longer you stayed in country, the more you realised the army's idea of a ration wasn't food or clean water. It was liquid courage, handed out in cans and bottles, with no one ever keeping track of the real cost. The jungle doesn't care about your beer. It doesn't care that it came all the way across the ocean in shiny aluminum cans, or that someone in St. Louis brewed it in a clean factory with polished floors. By the time it reaches you, it's been baked in the hold of a ship, rattled in the belly of a cargo plane, and sweated through on the back of a truck. Cold beer is a fantasy here. Every can you crack hisses with the promise of refreshment, then hits your tongue like soup. You get used to it, or at least you tell yourself you do. At first you gag, laugh with the guys about how it tastes like hot bread water. After a while you don't even notice. Warm beer becomes as much a part of Vietnam as the mosquitoes and the mud. You pop the tab, tilt it back, and swallow whatever temperature the jungle gives you. It's not just the heat. Refrigeration is scarce, almost mythical. A few bases manage to stash some units of beer in freezers, pulling them out for officers or special occasions. The rest of you drink it straight from the case, sticky with condensation, the liquid sloshing around inside like bath water. Sometimes you drop a can into a river or stream, hoping it cools down just enough before you drink it. But usually it just tastes like river and regret. There's a ritual to it. Patrol ends. You stumble back into camp. Boots caked in mud. Shirt plastered to your skin. Someone tosses you a can from the pile. It's hot, sweating in your hand, but you pop it anyway. The hiss is the closest thing to relief you're going to get. You sit in the dirt, legs stretched out, and drink slowly because there's nothing else to do until the next orders come down. Warm beer isn't refreshing, not really, but it gives you something to hold on to. Something familiar in a place that feels anything but. And yet, the heat makes it worse. Alcohol doesn't mix with dehydration. The sun beats down, the air feels like soup, and your body is already starved for water. A few cans in, and you're dizzy, light-headed, stomach-churning. You laugh it off, blame the weather, but you know what's really happening. You're drunk in the middle of a war zone, too tired to stand, too dry to sweat, and somehow still reaching for another can. The army knows it, yet they see the men stumbling, hear the slurred voices, smell the sour stench of beer sweating out of pores. But the crates keep coming. It's the cheapest form of comfort they can ship, and nobody questions whether it makes sense to hand out warm alcohol in a place where heat stroke is already a killer. Sometimes you dream about ice, just ice. A cold glass sweating in your hand, a sharp sting of chilled beer on your tongue. But ice doesn't exist here. Freezers belong to officers, and even then the power cuts out half the time. You joke about it with the others. Talk about the first cold drink you'll order when you get home. For now, you settle for cans that taste like they've been sitting on an engine block all afternoon. And the strangest thing is, it starts to feel normal. A hot war, hot nights, hot beer. You stop wishing for cold and just accept the warmth, because that's what Vietnam does. It takes away the things you thought were essential and replaces them with what's available. You drink it, you get drunk, you forget for a few hours, and that's all the war expects from you anyway. By the time the sun goes down, the beer isn't just about thirst anymore. It's about shutting the brain off. You drink to escape, and everyone around you does the same. The day is too long, the jungle too loud, and the silence in your own head too heavy. A few cans dull the edge, a few more blur it out completely. For some guys, that's the only way they can close their eyes at night. Not because they're tired, but because sleep doesn't come without the weight of booze pulling them under. It isn't just about escape, though. Drinking becomes its own language, a way of belonging. You share a can with the guy on the cot next to you, and suddenly you're closer than you were 5 minutes ago. A squad sits in a circle, passing around a bottle of whiskey someone scored from the PX, and every sip feels like a secret handshake. You're not just drinking. You're proving you're part of the group. If you refuse, if you say no, you stand out. And standing out in Vietnam is its own kind of danger. Better to join in. Better to match drink for drink, even if your stomach is turning inside out. Conversations start flowing the same way the alcohol does. Men who've been quiet all day, carrying their rifles in silence, suddenly open up after a few cans. They tell stories from home, describe girls they left behind, brag about cars they'll buy when they make it back. The laughter gets loud, the jokes crude, but underneath it all there's a relief, like for a brief moment they've stepped out of the war. Alcohol creates that little pocket of normal, even if it's an illusion. There's a darker side to it too. Escape means forgetting, but forgetting comes at a cost. Men who drink too much slip into blackouts, wake up with no memory of what they said or did. Bonds formed over beer sometimes end in fists, flying, bottle smashing, friendships tested by tempers that flared under the influence. The same alcohol that ties men together can just as easily tear them apart. But most nights it works. Booze softens the edges enough to make it through another day. You drink with the others because drinking alone feels dangerous. Alone, the thoughts creep back in. The faces of the men who didn't come back from patrol. The sound of gunfire still echoing in your ears. The realization that you might not make it home either. Together, the noise drowns that out. Together the bottles are emptied, the cans tossed into the growing pile by the tent flap, and the war feels just a little further away. Escape and bond, two sides of the same coin. Without booze, the nights would be unbearable. With it, they're survivable, if only barely. There's a moment before every patrol when the silence gets too heavy. You're sitting on your pack, rifle propped against your knee, waiting for the orders to move out. The jungle outside the wire hums with insects, but inside the camp, nobody's talking. You know what's coming, they know what's coming, and nobody wants to say it out loud. That's when the bottles come out. It's not official, not written in any manual, but it happens everywhere. A can of beer passed around, A quick swig of whiskey from a canteen disguised as water. Even a shot of rice wine bought from a local vendor earlier in the day. Call it courage, call it stupidity. But for a lot of soldiers it becomes ritual. One drink to calm the nerves before stepping into the green wall that swallows men whole. The routine looks the same, no matter where you are. A squad sitting in a circle. Helmets off, helmets on. It doesn't matter. Someone cracks open a can. The hiss loud in the stillness. And it gets passed around like communion. A sip each, just enough to take the edge off. Another guy unscrews a flask, tilts it back, and hands it over without a word. Nobody refuses. Refusing makes you look shaky, like you're not ready, and nobody wants to be the one dragging the squad down. The logic is simple. You're going out there anyway, and out there means mines, booby traps, and ambushes. The odds of coming back in one piece are already stacked against you. Better to go with a little fire in your stomach than with nothing but raw nerves. Some soldiers even swear it helps, makes their hands steadier, makes the fear blur into background noise. Whether it's true doesn't matter. What matters is believing it for long enough to take that first step beyond the wire. Sometimes it's quiet, almost ceremonial. A few swigs, a nod, a grunt, then helmets pulled down and rifles checked one last time. Other times it's louder, with jokes and forced laughter, men trying too hard to act casual while the alcohol loosens their tongues. Someone might shout, "To coming back!" and everyone drinks like the toast itself is a shield. Nobody says, "To survival," but that's what it really means. The officers know it happens. Some join in, some pretend not to see. Some even encourage it where morale is low. Better to have men lightly buzzed and willing than sober and paralysed by fear. The army's hidden bar tab stretches right into the jungle, and nobody writes it down. Of course, it doesn't always end well. A little liquid courage can become too much. A soldier stumbles in the line, trips on a route, fumbles with his rifle. Another gets loud when he should be silent, his laugh echoing down the trail until someone shoves him hard in the back to shut him up. Alcohol doesn't just blur fear, it blurs judgment, and in the jungle, bad judgment can kill more than just the man who made it. Still, the ritual persists. Because the alternative is walking out there stone cold sober, heart racing, hands trembling, every sound amplified until the jungle itself feels like it's breathing down your neck. A sip, a swallow, a shared bottle. It doesn't erase the fear, but it muffles it just enough. And when the order finally comes, when the squad stands up and slings their rifles, nobody's thinking about the long-term cost. They're just thinking about putting one foot in front of the other. So the cans get drained, the bottles tucked away, and the patrol moves out. The ritual ends where the tree line begins, but the warmth in the gut lingers, carrying each man a little further into the unknown. When the sun drops behind the jungle and the patrols stumble back through the wire, that's when the nights start. The barracks never go quiet. The war doesn't switch off at dusk, but the way men deal with it changes. Guns get leaned against bunks, boots kicked into the mud, shirts peeled off in the sticky heat. Someone cracks open the first can, and the sound cuts through the heavy air like a signal. The day is over, the drinking begins. It never takes long before the place turns into something between a bar and a cage. Soldiers sprawled on cots with bottles balanced on their chests. Others sitting cross-legged on the floor with cards and piles of beer stacked in the middle. Cigarette smoke hangs low, mixing with the sour reek of sweat and spilled liquor. The laughter starts thin, almost forced, then grows louder as the bottles empty. Someone shouts across the room. Another belt out half a song he can't finish. A few join in anyway, their voices breaking but steady enough to drown the silence. Every barracks has its characters. The loud drunk who tells the same story every night, swearing it gets funnier with each retelling. The quiet drinker who doesn't say a word until his fifth can, then suddenly won't shut up. The angry one who looks for a fight in every joke. And the sad one who ends up crying into his sleeve about the girl back home who stopped writing. The alcohol sorts men into categories faster than the army ever could. Fist fights break out as often as card games. One wrong word, one lost bet, one man laughing too hard at the wrong story, and fists are flying, bottles shattering, blood dripping onto the concrete floor. Nobody calls for the MPs. The fight burns itself out. Both men collapsing in the corner, bruised and drunk. Friends again by morning. Violence becomes as much a part of the nightly ritual as the drinking itself. But there are softer moments too. Nights when a circle forms around a single soldier telling a story that actually matters. One about a childhood baseball game, or a father's advice, or the sound of his mother's voice. Everyone listens, silent for once, the beer passing slowly around the group. For a brief time, the barracks feel less like a holding pen and more like a living room, a strange, smoky version of home where men cling to scraps of normal life. Sleep doesn't come easy in the barracks, even drunk. While the air is too heavy, the mosquitoes too relentless, the sound of artillery thudding in the distance too steady to ignore. Men pass out on their cots, sprawled in every direction, bottles rolling on the floor, cans crushed under boots. Some mutter in their sleep, flinching like they're still on patrol. Others snore loud enough to shake the walls. Nobody rests easy, but the alcohol drags them under, at least for a few hours. By morning the place reeks. Stale beer, vomit in a corner bucket, sweat-soaked sheets, and bodies groaning awake with pounding heads. The ritual of the night gives way to the hangover of the day. And still, when the next evening comes, the cycle repeats. Because the barracks aren't just a place to sleep, they're a place to forget. And forgetting only happens one can at a time. Everyone knew the officers could smell it. You couldn't hide beer breath in the jungle. You couldn't cover whiskey fumes with a cigarette. When a squad stumbled into formation reeking of alcohol, uniforms half-buttoned, eyes bloodshot, nobody thought they'd gotten away with it. The officers just didn't say anything. They looked the other way because in Vietnam, discipline was negotiable, but morale was fragile. It wasn't that officers didn't care. It was that they drank too. Captains with private stashes in desk drawers, lieutenants sipping from metal cups during briefings, sergeants taking swigs before writing up the day's report. The line between enlisted man and officer blurred when the bottles came out. Everyone was in the same mud, under the same sun, hearing the same mortars. Alcohol didn't respect rank, and rank didn't fight too hard to stop it. Sometimes the tolerance bordered on absurd. A patrol would return half drunk, stumbling through the wire, and instead of punishment, they'd be told to get some sleep. A man caught with a bottle in his pack wasn't written up, just warned not to spill it during inspection. When fights broke out in the barracks, officers walked past the noise, shaking their heads but never stepping inside. They needed bodies to keep moving, not spotless records. In theory, rules existed. Drinking was supposed to be controlled, kept to off-duty hours, limited to rations. In practice, rules collapsed under the weight of reality. The officers knew their men were scared, exhausted, stretched thin. If a few beers made them show up the next morning ready to carry a rifle, then a few beers weren't worth fighting over. Cracking down too hard risked rebellion, or worse, men shutting down completely. So the bottles rolled on, and the officers pretended not to see. Every now and then, an officer tried to enforce discipline. A raid on the barracks, bottles confiscated, rations cut. It never lasted. Within a week, the alcohol flowed again, smuggled in through PX connections, or bought from locals just outside the wire. The men knew how to get it, and the officers knew they couldn't stop it. Looking the other way wasn't weakness, it was resignation. And when the higher-ups came around, inspections and visiting brass, suddenly everything looked cleaner. Bottles vanished, cans got buried, uniforms snapped into place. The officers barked orders, played the part, made it look like discipline still ruled the camp. But as soon as the visitors left, the beer came back out, and the war returned to its unofficial normal. The officers weren't blind. They understood that alcohol was a double-edged blade, steadying hands on one side, sloppy mistakes on the other. But the war was already messy, already chaotic, already unwinnable in ways nobody wanted to admit. In that kind of environment, a little chaos from booze hardly seemed like the worst problem, and so they kept looking away, night after night, letting the cans pile up, hoping it would hold the men together just long enough for another patrol. Another day survived. Drinking to blur the edges was one thing. Drinking until you blacked out was another. And it happened more often than anyone wanted to admit. Men passed out in the barracks, in the mud outside tents, even slumped against sandbags with rifles sliding from their laps. Sometimes they woke up a few hours later, confused but fine. Sometimes they didn't wake up at all until the next morning, groggy and disoriented, trying to remember what they'd done or said the night before. And sometimes the blackout happened in the worst possible place, outside the wire, in the middle of a war zone. The line between buzzed and gone was thin when the heat pressed down. The beer flowed endlessly, and fear chewed at the edges of your mind. You told yourself you'd just have a couple to take the edge off before patrol, but a couple turned into 6, and 6 turned into not remembering how you even got into formation. You marched into the jungle on autopilot, the details fuzzy, the edges smeared. Later, when you tried to recall the mission, the images didn't connect. A gunshot here, a face there, and then nothing but static where the rest of the memory should have been. In the barracks, blackouts turned into comedy for some, and tragedy for others. A guy would wake up covered in vomit, his uniform ruined, his buddies laughing as they filled in the blanks with wild stories. Another would find his wallet empty, not sure if he lost the money or gambled it away in a haze. And then there were the darker tales, the ones nobody laughed about, waking up with blood on your knuckles and no idea whose face you'd hit, or stumbling out of a blackout to realise you'd been waving a loaded rifle around in a crowded room. The worst part wasn't just what happened during blackouts. It was what didn't happen. Orders missed. Guard posts left unmanned. Radios unanswered because the man assigned to them was unconscious on the floor. Eyes rolled back, body limp. In Vietnam, blackouts weren't just embarrassing. They were dangerous. The jungle didn't care that you had drunk yourself senseless. The enemy didn't pause because you couldn't remember your own name. And yet, it kept happening. Because blackouts were also the closest thing some men had to real escape. Passing out meant not thinking, not feeling, not remembering the things that crawled into your head when you lay awake sober. Forgetting for a night, even if it came with bruises, hangovers, or missing hours, felt worth the price. The gamble was that sometimes the missing hours weren't harmless. Sometimes they were the ones that mattered most. So the cans kept cracking, the bottles kept draining, and the blackouts kept coming. In a combat zone, where memory could be the difference between life and death, men willingly traded clarity for oblivion. And the war rolled on, indifferent to whether they were conscious for all of it or not. Morning in Vietnam never gave you a choice. The sun hit like a hammer, the humidity wrapped around your chest, and the insects screamed loud enough to drill straight into your skull. Add a hangover to that mix, and it wasn't just miserable, it was torture. Men rolled out of their bunks, clutching their heads, eyes squinting against the light, stomachs churning from cheap beer and cheaper whiskey. The war didn't wait for anyone to recover. Orders came down whether your brain was pounding or not. Hangovers in a combat zone weren't just headaches, they were survival risks. A soldier stumbling to formation with a pounding head and shaky hands still had to sling his rifle, still had to march into the jungle, still had to react when the first shot cracked through the trees. Reaction time slowed, vision blurred, balance wobbled. The kind of impairments that might not matter back home, but here could get someone killed. You saw it everywhere. Men wiping sweat from their foreheads, blinking hard to force focus, leaning on their rifles like canes while trying not to throw up on their boots. Patrols moved slower, steps dragging in the mud. Tempers flared quicker, voices snapped over nothing. A squad hung over together wasn't just sluggish, it was vulnerable. Sometimes the enemy knew it. Attacks at dawn weren't a coincidence. The Viet Cong understood that mornings were when Americans were weakest, when the booze from the night before still clouded their systems. Mortar shells landing before sunrise didn't just disrupt sleep, they turned hangovers into chaos. Men scrambled for helmets, tripping over empty cans, ears ringing from explosions and from the pounding inside their own heads. Some fired wildly, others froze, their thoughts too slow to catch up with the danger. The medics had no sympathy. They saw the pattern daily. Men lined up complaining of headaches, nausea, dizziness. Not malaria, not dysentery, not heat stroke. Just hangovers, dressed up as medical complaints. The cure wasn't pills or bandages. It was water, if you trusted it, or another beer if you didn't. Some soldiers swore by the hair of the dog, cracking open a fresh can at dawn to smooth out the crash. It worked just long enough to get them moving, but it dug the hole deeper for tomorrow. Even officers dragged themselves through the haze. Briefings in the morning reeked of alcohol, maps spread on tables while men rubbed their temples, sipping coffee spiked with whatever they had left. Orders came out slurred, plans patched together by men still halfway drunk. Soldiers joked that half the war was fought hungover, and the joke wasn't far from the truth. The jungle didn't forgive it. Heat pressed down harder when your body was already dehydrated. Every step felt heavier, every sound sharper. Gunfire cut like knives through your skull. A hangover back home might mean calling in sick, lying in bed, hiding behind sunglasses. Here, it meant stumbling through rice paddies with bullets snapping overhead, praying your stomach didn't give out at the worst possible moment. And when it did, Nobody forgot it. The soldier who doubled over mid-patrol, vomiting into the mud while his squad crouched around him, rifles raised and eyes scanning the tree line. The man who fired too late because his brain was still fogged from the night before. The buddy who went down not because he was careless, but because his cover was slow, distracted, hungover. Those stories spread faster than the hangover cures, reminders that the cost of last night's drinking didn't stop when the bottles were empty. But still, the cycle went on, because the fear didn't stop either, and for many the choice was clear: suffer sober at night or suffer hungover under fire. Most picked the latter, and the war kept grinding, with men fighting enemies in the jungle and the pounding in their own skulls at the same time. Alcohol didn't just blur the nights, it bled into everything else, and the consequences weren't always hidden. Accidents piled up, small at first. A man tripping over a tent rope and splitting his forehead open, another fumbling his rifle during cleaning and sending a round through the ceiling. Everyone laughed, patched it up, shrugged it off. But in Vietnam, accidents had sharper edges. A careless stumble in the jungle could mean triggering a mine. A dropped weapon wasn't just embarrassing, it could be fatal. The fights came next. Booze loosened tempers as much as tongues, and cramped barracks full of young men simmered like pressure cookers. Arguments over cards turned into brawls. Insults that would have been shrugged off sober became reasons to throw punches. Bottles smashed against walls, fists connected with jaws, boots kicked until someone pulled the two men apart. The bruises and black eyes were explained away as roughhousing, but everyone knew they came from nights when the cans stacked too high and patience ran too thin. Sometimes the fights got uglier. Knives flashed, rifles swung like clubs, blood spilled on the barracks floor. The MPs dragged men out, sobbing or shouting, while the rest of the barracks pretended to be asleep. Punishments rarely stuck. The men were needed too badly. A few days of extra duty, maybe a dock in pay, and they were back in formation, the cycle starting all over again. And then there was the worst outcome: friendly fire. Alcohol dulled judgment, slowed reflexes, blurred vision. A man on guard duty, drunk enough to see shadows moving where there were none, pulled the trigger too fast. A soldier staggering out of the latrine in the dark caught a bullet meant for an imagined enemy. Patrols returning late were mistaken for ambushes by hungover sentries who fired before thinking. Every man knew the stories. Some had seen it themselves. The flash of a rifle, the scream of a buddy going down, the sickening realization that the enemy hadn't fired a shot. Official reports buried it. Accidents were listed as training mishaps. Fights became disciplinary incidents. Friendly fire disappeared into the vague language of combat casualties. Nobody wanted to admit that beer and whiskey were as dangerous as bullets. But in the barracks, in the hushed conversations after lights out, the truth circulated. Men knew who had been drinking, who had been careless, who hadn't made it home because someone else couldn't tell the difference between fear and a hangover. Still, the bottles kept opening, because even with the risks, even with the accidents and the fights, the drinking felt necessary. Without it, the silence was unbearable. With it, the war just took a different shape. Beer and whiskey were never enough for long. Vietnam was flooded with other ways to escape, and alcohol didn't stay separate for very long. Pills showed up in footlockers, joints passed quietly in the corners of barracks, Powders slipped into hands during PX runs. The lines blurred until booze was just the starting point, the first step before something stronger. Marijuana was everywhere. Soldiers bought it from locals for pocket change, rolled it in paper ripped from letters or field manuals, and smoked it while drinking warm beer by the crate. The combination dulled nerves in a way alcohol alone couldn't, blurring the edges of the jungle into something less menacing. Men laughed harder, slurred longer, sank deeper into the haze. Officers pretended not to notice unless it got out of hand. Pills came next. Uppers, downers, whatever could be found. Some soldiers washed them down with beer to keep from feeling the exhaustion that settled into their bones. Others paired liquor with sedatives, slipping from buzzed to unconscious in minutes. Word spread fast when someone had a new supply. A few traded rations for pills. Others pooled money to buy them in bulk. Bottles clinked with tablets hidden between the alcohol, a deadly mix no one kept track of. Then came heroin, cheap and potent, sold in little plastic vials or folded paper packets. Some soldiers snorted it with beer still in their system, chasing a deeper oblivion than alcohol could offer. Others shot it straight into their veins, a bottle of whiskey close at hand to keep the nod going. The jungle was unforgiving, and so was the mix. Men who might have handled their booze lost themselves completely when other drugs entered the picture. The combinations blurred judgment beyond recognition. Patrols went out with men stumbling not just from alcohol, but from cocktails of liquor and narcotics. Sentries nodded off at their posts, rifles slipping from limp fingers. Radios went unanswered, coordinates relayed wrong, friendly units nearly firing on each other because someone was too high to speak straight. The consequences piled up in silence. Overdoses written off as heat exhaustion. Bad trips explained as combat stress. Men quietly shipped home for medical reasons when their addictions got too obvious. Alcohol made the drugs easier to take, and the drugs made the alcohol hit harder, until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Everyone knew it, but no one stopped it. Because in a place where survival meant making it through one more day, any escape seemed worth the risk. And once alcohol had cracked the door open, the rest came rushing in. Alcohol wasn't just in the body, it got into the mind. At first it dulled the edges, blurred the noise, made the days a little easier. But as the months dragged on, it started chewing through men from the inside out. You could see it in their faces. Eyes that never fully focused, smiles that never reached past the lips, voices that cracked when the bottles ran dry. Booze wasn't just a drink anymore. It was a crutch, and without it, the weight of the war crushed down even harder. Morale slipped in ways the army couldn't chart on paper. A squad fresh from the PX, with cases stacked in the corner, looked fine for a night, but by the third day of non-stop drinking, the cracks showed. Men stopped caring about inspections. Rifles sat uncleaned, uniforms stained, boots left muddy. Tasks that once took minutes stretched into hours because nobody had the focus to get them done. What looked like laziness was really exhaustion, wrapped in hangovers. A whole unit running on fumes and alcohol haze. Conversations got darker too. Drunken talk turned from jokes and home stories to bitter complaints. Slurred arguments about why they were even there. Men cursed their officers, cursed the politicians back home, cursed themselves for not finding a way out. Alcohol stripped away the thin layer of obedience, leaving only the raw frustration beneath. Some laughed it off. Others shouted until fists flew. A few went quiet, staring at the floor with bottles clutched so tight their knuckles turned white. For some, it slid further. Drunken confessions about nightmares that wouldn't stop, about faces seen in the jungle, about pulling the trigger and not knowing who went down. Booze loosened tongues, but it didn't heal wounds. It just dragged them into the open where everyone else had to listen. And once the words were out, there was no taking them back. The toll showed up in discipline reports, in fights logged as minor incidents, in patrols that came back disorganised, in squads that moved like shadows of themselves. Officers shook their heads, muttered about morale problems, but morale wasn't the problem. Alcohol was the symptom. The real issue was that the war itself hollowed men out, and booze filled the empty space with something that rotted even faster. Still, nobody stopped it. Because as much as it eroded focus, it also kept men going. A drunk soldier who laughed with his buddies was easier to manage than a sober one staring into the dark, realising just how hopeless things were. Morale was measured in empty cans as much as in mission reports, and by that standard, the army's bar tab was the only thing holding some men together. Mail call was supposed to be the cleanest connection back to normal life. A thin envelope from home, the smell of paper instead of gunpowder, a voice scrawled in ink that reminded you who you were before the war. But the letters that went out from Vietnam weren't always clean. They reeked of the barracks, of smoke, of sweat, and often of spilled whiskey. Families back in the States unfolded pages that carried the faint, sour burn of alcohol, proof that their son or husband or brother hadn't been sober when he wrote it. Some letters rambled, words slanted across the page, sentences that looped or broke off halfway through. A man sat on his cot with a bottle propped against his knee, pen scratching while his vision blurred, writing things he never would have said sober. He promised everything would be fine, swore he wasn't scared, bragged about how well he was holding up. But the stains on the paper told another story. A ring from a glass at the bottom corner, a blot where his hand shook, the faint brown smear where liquor splashed and dried. Others went darker. Slurred confessions scrawled into paragraphs that made little sense, the booze giving courage to put down words he'd regret later. Admissions of nightmares, of fear, of things he'd seen but couldn't say out loud without help from the bottle. Families read them in kitchens and living rooms thousands of miles away, frowning over phrases that didn't sound like the boy they remembered. Mothers tucked them away in drawers. Wives reread them until the paper frayed. Kids puzzled over the strange smell clinging to the page. The army censored some of it. Black lines crossing out names, places, details. But the smell couldn't be censored. And neither could the shaky handwriting that told families their soldier wasn't writing with a clear head. Some wives recognised the patterns immediately. They'd seen the same handwriting after late nights back home, when their husband staggered in from a bar. Now it came from halfway across the world, sealed in an envelope with an APO stamp. For the soldiers, the letters were half comfort, half confession. The booze made it easier to write, easier to pretend things weren't as bad, or easier to spill the truth in a way they couldn't face sober. Either way, the pages carried more than words. They carried the weight of the bottle, the proof that alcohol followed them even into their attempts at connection. And when the replies came back, cheerful notes from wives, careful encouragement from parents, pictures of kids with forced smiles, the soldiers read them with bottles in hand. The cycle kept turning. Write drunk, read drunk, live drunk, and hope the people at home didn't notice how much of the war had soaked into every word. Eventually, even the officers who'd been looking the other way couldn't ignore it. Too many accidents, too many fights, too many patrols stumbling back half drunk. Command tried to tighten the reins, but their grip was shaky at best. Official memos went out. Stern warnings about discipline, limits on rations, threats of punishment for intoxication on duty. The words looked serious on paper, but paper didn't stand a chance against a jungle full of booze. The first tactic was cutting back the PX supplies. Cases of beer didn't show up as often. Bottles of whiskey disappeared from the shelves. For a week or two, it seemed like someone was actually serious about cracking down, but the soldiers adapted instantly. If the PX ran dry, they bought from locals. If whiskey was scarce, rice wine filled the gap. Alcohol wasn't a luxury anymore, it was a necessity, and no memo from command was going to change that. Next came inspections. Surprise checks of footlockers and barracks. Officers stomping through rows of cots with clipboards, barking at men to stand aside while they searched. Bottles were pulled out, cans tossed into piles, names written down. It looked effective for a day. By nightfall, new bottles had already replaced the old ones. The jungle economy was faster than army paperwork. Some units even tried punishment patrols. Men caught drinking too much were sent on grueling marches in the heat, hauling gear until they dropped. The idea was to break the habit through exhaustion. Instead, it just convinced soldiers to drink more after, the bottle becoming both the cause and cure of their misery. The harder command pushed, the deeper the dependence seemed to sink. Every now and then an example was made. A man stripped of rank, pay docked, duties doubled. But the punishment rarely stuck, because bodies were needed in the field more than rules were needed in the barracks. A soldier who could still carry a rifle was worth more drunk than sober in a cell. Command knew it, the men knew it, and the cycle kept rolling. The desperation showed in the tone of the orders. Lectures about duty and honour, speeches about representing America, warnings about the dangers of alcohol abuse. But the men listening knew the same officers had their own bottles hidden away. The words rang hollow, drowned out by the hiss of a can cracking open after the meeting ended. It wasn't that command didn't care. It was that they couldn't solve the real problem. Alcohol wasn't just rebellion or laziness. It was survival. The only shield some men had against the weight pressing down on them every day. Taking it away didn't cure the fear. It just left it raw. And so even the strictest attempts at control unravelled, leaving behind nothing but more empty cans, more broken rules, and more officers pretending not to notice. Coming home didn't mean the drinking stayed behind. For a lot of men, the booze followed them across the ocean, stuffed inside their habits as tightly as the uniforms in their duffel bags. Vietnam ended, but the bottles didn't. The hangover stretched on, long after the war had spit them back into civilian life. At first, nobody noticed. A soldier stepped off the plane, hugged his family, smiled for the photographs. He told himself he'd slow down, that the drinking had been part of the war, something he'd needed out there, but didn't need anymore. But the first night back, the silence of a clean bedroom felt stranger than the barracks. No artillery, no helicopters, no shouting. Just quiet. And quiet meant thinking. So he cracked a beer. 1 turned into 3. 3 turned into a 6-pack. And before long he was right back in the rhythm he thought he'd left overseas. The difference was that at home, nobody was drinking the same way. His friends from before the war had jobs, families, routines that didn't revolve around the bottom of a bottle. He felt out of step, too loud at bars, too reckless at parties, too quick to reach for another round. The same drinking that bonded him to his squad left him isolated back home. For some, the hangover wasn't just social, it was physical. Years of pounding warm beer and cheap whiskey had torn through their bodies. Livers scarred, stomachs eroded, hands shaking if they went too long without a drink. They were barely 25, but their bodies felt twice that. Doctors asked questions they didn't want to answer, and families tried to pretend it was just adjustment, not addiction. The hardest part was the mind. Booze in Vietnam had blurred the memories, softened the nightmares, numbed the fear. Back home, the nightmares didn't stop, and neither did the need to drown them. Men woke up sweating, heart racing, reaching for bottles before the sun was up. Letters from the VA piled on the counter, pamphlets about treatment stacked unread. Some tried meetings, some tried quitting cold, but many just kept drinking because it was easier than facing the silent sober. The long hangover didn't show up in casualty lists or victory speeches. It showed up in divorce papers, in bar fights, in jobs lost, in children watching fathers stumble in late and reeking of whiskey. Vietnam didn't just end when the last soldier came home. It lived on in kitchens and living rooms, in bottles clinking into trash cans week after week, in the steady erosion of lives already frayed by the war. And through it all, the country looked away, just like the officers had. The war was over, and nobody wanted to tally the hidden costs. The hangover wasn't written in history books, but it dragged on for decades, one drink at a time. The bottles didn't just wear down the men who drank them, they wore down the people waiting at home too. Families who had spent months clinging to letters finally got their sons and husbands back, only to realise the war hadn't let go of them. It had just followed them into the house, poured into glasses at the kitchen table, spilled onto the carpet in arguments and slammed doors. Wives who had pictured tearful reunions found themselves dealing with husbands who came home restless, volatile, always reaching for a bottle. The drinking that started in Vietnam as a way to cope kept rolling long after the uniforms were hung in closets. Arguments began over small things. Bills unpaid, late nights at the bar, a smell of whiskey on his breath at breakfast. Soon, it wasn't small anymore. Voices rose, fists slammed into tables. Children cried in bedrooms down the hall while the bottles clinked in the sink. Some marriages collapsed fast. Divorce papers stacked up at courthouses, names of veterans appearing again and again. Others dragged on for years. Families held together by habit and hope, each day marked by another round of broken promises. The soldier who once swore he'd stop drinking after deployment found himself pouring another glass before dawn, telling himself he needed it just to function. Children grew up with fathers who were half present, men whose minds were still stuck in the jungle, whose tempers snapped under the haze of booze. Some kids learned to tiptoe around the house, to avoid the nights when their father staggered in, eyes glazed, words slurred. Others fought back, clashing with the man who'd fought in a war, but couldn't fight the bottle. Generations carried scars from a habit that had started in sweltering barracks halfway across the world, and the futures those soldiers imagined, steady jobs, homes, stability, slipped through their fingers. Hangovers made mornings unreliable, and employers noticed. DUI charges stacked up in court records. Some men drifted from job to job, unable to hold one long enough to build a life. Others ended up in VA hospitals, their bodies failing before their time, livers ruined, stomachs bleeding, hearts weakened. For many, the war didn't end in the jungle. It ended in living rooms, in bars, in hospital beds, years later. The damage slow but relentless. The families left behind carried their own weight, picking up the pieces of futures that had been broken not by bullets but by bottles. And still, the drinking rarely stopped. Because for the men who carried the war inside them, there was no easy way back. The alcohol that had once bonded them to their brothers in arms left them isolated from the people who needed them most. Futures dissolved the same way cans once did. Cracked open, drained, tossed aside. The war ended on paper, but its taste lingered. Not in medals or speeches, not in the faded photographs tucked into drawers, but in bottles lined up on kitchen counters and cans crushed underfoot in garages. Vietnam's legacy wasn't just jungles and firefights. For many, it was the quiet ruin that followed them home, carried in the steady pour of whiskey, the endless hiss of beer tabs cracking open. The army had built alcohol into daily life, made it part of the routine, part of survival. That routine didn't vanish with discharge papers. It travelled back with the men, seeped into their habits until drinking was as natural as breathing. Whole communities of veterans carried the same scars, not just memories of combat, but livers scarred from years of trying to drown those memories. The country didn't talk about it much. Politicians spoke of sacrifice, of duty, of lessons learned. Families whispered about the drinking, the outbursts, the broken marriages, the men who never seemed to come all the way back. Bars filled with veterans sitting shoulder to shoulder, drinking in silence because words failed them. VA hospitals filled with patients whose medical charts read like extensions of the Army's hidden bar tab. And the younger generations noticed. Kids who grew up in houses where bottles were always half empty learned that the war hadn't really ended. It had just shifted shape. They inherited fathers who were distant, mothers who carried the burden, homes where alcohol was both the glue and the wedge. Vietnam's legacy wasn't only in history books. It was in family trees, in patterns that stretched on long, after the fighting stopped. Even today, the numbers tell the story. High rates of alcoholism among veterans. Health problems tied directly back to those years of warm beer and cheap liquor in the barracks. The statistics confirm what the soldiers already knew in their bones. The war didn't leave when they did. It followed them, waiting at the bottom of every bottle. For those who lived it, Vietnam is remembered not just in firefights and ambushes, but in the hangovers, the blackouts, the empty cans stacked like sandbags against memories too heavy to carry sober. The war carved its mark in mud and blood, but its legacy carried on in glass and aluminum long after the last shot was fired. And that's the thing about Vietnam. When people think of it, they picture the helicopters, the firefights, the thick jungle swallowing whole squads. But for the men who lived it, a lot of the war was measured in bottles and cans, in the haze of hangovers and the blur of nights they couldn't remember. Alcohol wasn't in the history books, but it was everywhere in the barracks, in patrol packs, in the letters sent home stained with whiskey. It followed them back across the ocean, shaping their lives long after the jungle was gone. If you've stayed with me through all of this, I hope it gave you a different glimpse into the war. Not the medals or the maps, but the messier truth. The kind that smelled like sweat and beer more than gunpowder. If you found yourself sinking into it, maybe even nodding off as the story rolled on, that's fine too. That's what this is for. If you'd like more nights like this, you know what to do. Hit like, subscribe, share where you're listening from. It always amazes me to see how far these stories travel, even when they're about moments people would rather forget. For now, close your eyes, let the noise fade, and drift. The helicopters, the shouting, the bottles clinking, let them all fall quiet. The war is still there in the background, but tonight you don't need to carry it.